My topic tonight is called the Untapped Resilience of the Millennial. I'm going to start on a kind of a journey that takes us into the unresilience of the millennial and hopefully end on a very positive note, because I'm really worried that if I don't, I'm outnumbered here. I think the boomers and the millennials are maybe a saw off, but they're younger and faster. So here's a quote. You know, I always like to start with a good quote. Here's one I would like you to hear. Children began to be the tyrants, not the slaves of their household. They no longer rose from their seats when an elder entered the room, God forbid. They contradicted their parents, chattered before company, gobbled up the dainties at the table, and committed various offenses against our tastes, such as crossing their legs. Now, it's an interesting quote. It makes me curious, like when I saw it, what time period would that be? That was written 2,500 years ago by Socrates, as he was criticizing the younger generation. So I want to first begin this because anytime we talk about cohorts or generational cohorts, we always run the risk of stereotyping. And the last thing I want to do is be that guy that stereotyped millennials and every other group. What I really want to speak about tonight is some of the benchmarking and the defining elements of those generational cohorts, but specifically related to the boomer-millennial interchange. And I know there's some Gen Y, or Gen X, the Gen Xers out there are going, damn, we get left out of the conversation again. But we'll get there. I also want you to hear that it's not a pure scientific process. There's nothing clean. It's not a petri dish of generational cultures. And it just merely helps us provide kind of guideposts along the highway as we go. And I'm also aware that I have to be very, very, mind my P's and Q's tonight and be very aware of the fact that I come from an organization with over 100 employees, of which there are around 30 or so Gen Xers, 70 millennials, and 2 boomers. So if I get too off of my sweeping generalizations tonight, I run the risk of getting really torched later. So let me talk about the 4 generational cohorts we'll reference this in. And there may be people tonight, I think in all 4 generations, I would imagine. But the greatest generation, 1925 to 45, 15 years or so. The boomer generation, of which I belong, and I suspect a lot of you here, there's a fair amount tonight, 46 to 1964. And one of the things that's really interesting in this is that the Canadian boomer started after the American boomer. We were a year late on our boom. They stayed in England, the Canadians, to help the British get back on their feet. So those Americans, they were pretty industrious. They got right back at to making babies right after the war. And then there's Gen X, 1965 to 84, and then Gen Y, or you'll hear in the literature Gen Y millennial. I just kind of split it down the middle and said it was 1980 to 2000 in that 20-year period. So as I wanted to speak about, I thought, what would be the best way to speak about these generations? I thought, well, let's talk about a metaphor. Let's use a metaphor. They're always great. And the metaphor I've chosen is one of climate. So let's look at the greatest generation. They are moved, what I call, from a journey from the desert of the 30s and 40s and arrived to the verdant lands only in their 50s. This generation is marked predominantly by service and altruism, as many of them served in the war and actually came out of the Great Depression or on the cusp of that, so had a very strong reality about what that was about. And they were the very first to experience that sense of economic explosion because they saw the boomer come after them and just everything took off. It was this incredible vitality. The second group, the boomer generation, is what I call a byproduct of the sunshine generation, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Boomers were born into the lush green land of plenty with nothing but sunshine and rainbows. Truly an unprecedented tsunami of growth. It was unprecedented. Jim Collins, in his book, Great by Choice, talks about when he was asked the question about turbulence in today's world, whether it will be ever returning to the normal. And of course, that person's referencing the boomer years, the golden years. And Collins says, there was never. This was not what normal looks like. He said that was an anomaly in time. There was unprecedented with peace, economic prosperity, give or take the Korean War, and the Cold War. It was a time unprecedented. This is what we grew up in. And we came in riding this prosperity, and the boomers' presence impacted every part of society, from the building of schools to the production of baby diapers, to sprawling suburbs and yet SUVs, to hip replacements and Viagra. And in the future, who knows, maybe we'll see an increase in diaper sales again. My wife told me not to put that in. Gen X, okay, here we are. They grew up in the rain shadow. They received neither the rain nor the sunshine required to truly nurture them. They experienced the economic downsizing and right-sizing. They watched their parents have to grapple with cradle to grave no longer being their reality, that those jobs just don't exist anymore. They were featured in Maclean's magazine in early 1990s. A whole magazine was dedicated to the idea that the boom or the Gen Xer is the first generation that will never do better collectively than their parents. Each generation seemed to have that momentum as they moved forward, but not Gen X. And even more frustrating, they were the first with information technology, and they would go into the work site and the little boomers would say, "Teach me how to do this," only to take their jobs and their careers and hang in there a little bit longer. It's an interesting dynamic. So truly what happened, the Gen X became the mercenary. And the mercenary continued into the next generation. They really were not about loyalty to their employer. They were really about, I'm going to take care of myself. The last one, this kind of leads to the one we're talking about tonight, the Millennial or Gen Y. They were what we call the rain cloud and some sunshine generation. Not nearly enough sunshine, of course, and never getting too wet, as their boomer parent followed them around with an umbrella. So in this literature, I got some words. I said, let's see what people are saying out there. And by the way, I want you to hear this. This is not just outside, this millennial generation speaking about themselves as well. I bet you somebody can give me a few words. Let's try it. Anybody got a word that you think might describe the millennial? Well, entitled, did I hear? That was the first one on my list. Ambivalent, uncommitted, those damn Gen Xers or Gen Y. Narcissistic, uncommitted, coddled, overprotected, self-absorbed, wasteful little trophy kids taking selfies. To name but a few. And it's important to note, this is not what I would call overly flattering, but how did the millennial arrive to such of these generational perceptions? And I thought this might be an interesting thing to look at. And first I want you to set a context again about what we call the millennial malaise. In some of the literature, we see it as actually being predominantly a white, affluent North American phenomena, and you see it in the African American communities. They go, and other communities saying, it's just those white kids, they got too much money. But it is again a benchmark, so we'll come to that. So what happened? Well, what happened is all the millennials were given red ribbons. Everyone got a red ribbon. Everybody got a trophy. I think what happened is it reduced our sense of internal competitiveness. When we talk about resiliency, we talk about this inside-out view of the world. The other one was the millennials were overprotected from risk. And I really believe that we do a great disservice to children when we do not teach them how to risk responsibly. And this ongoing and progressive exposure to risk is what we call inoculation to stress. It's like getting a little bit of the virus in us that strengthens our whole immune system. And then the millennial had their stress medicated. I've heard a lot of stuff about that tonight, and again, broad sweeping generalizations, so don't kill me just yet. You can do that later. But think about it. How much anti-anxiety medication is going out there? Rising levels of depression and suicides. And the millennial continues to be protected from harm as they move their way into the university years. And one of the things that an article that I read in Atlantic magazine, September 2015, it talked about the concept of trigger warnings and microaggressions. So anybody wants to know what a trigger warning is? It means that you as a professor or somebody giving me right now, giving a workshop, I have to say to you, this is PG-13, or this is restricted. God forbid we should offend somebody and trigger a microaggression, trigger something deep inside, a trauma reaction. And in this article, The Coddling of the American Mind, I'll read you a quote. Something strange is happening at America's colleges and universities. A movement is arising, undirected and driven largely by students, to scrub campuses clean of words, ideas, and subjects that might cause discomfort or give offense. Last December, Jeannie Suk wrote in an online article with the New Yorker about law students asking her fellow professors at Harvard not to teach rape law, or in one case, even use the word violate, as in it violates the law, lest it cause students distress. Interesting. So now that we've examined these conditions, I just want to speak to what happened with the boomer. Because I really believe, as a boomer, raising millennial children, I take a lot of responsibility for what happened. We were the parents. So let's talk about that role. I think in many ways the millennial grew up in the boomer's rain shadow. So the boomer parent replaced risk with fear. And when did risk become such a bad thing? I want you to hear this. There's a transference of fear that's happened very first to the boomer generation. It's now gaining momentum. And it happened when we had this plethora of CNN and other social media that went worldwide. If there was a predator in Edmonton or Red Deer in Calgary, that was enough to make us hypervigilant and bring us to some level of arousal. But my God, things are happening 5,000 miles away, yet we experience them right here in our sensations like they're happening here now. And that projects over. That carries over. And I'll give you one example from the 90s. Anybody remembers this, has been around long enough to see this image of the little Bulger boy being led out of a subway station in England, captured on closed-circuit TV, with another young man holding his hand as they walked out, and him never to be seen alive again. That image seared into the consciousness of boomer parents. That and hundreds of others, those images. The boomer parent introduced them to the social media. Those were the first babysitters. We were the ones that gave them that and left them go with that, and maybe didn't take the responsibility that we needed to develop the human-to-human connection. And the boomer parents supported narcissism. We talk about this narcissistic society of millennials. Well, wait a minute. Who here remembers the Kodak Instamatic camera? Anyone? Put your hand up. Yeah? You got some selfies from that? You got them pinned up somewhere? If you had one. And the handheld movie camera that weighed about 750 pounds. This is how it all began. You just think of this. It started there. And I think the boomer also had this over-infatuation with self-esteem. I mean, my God, everybody wants our children to do better than us. But it's somehow they knew that maybe they didn't, they weren't. They weren't going to do as well as us, so I have to compensate. In many ways, maybe a millennial is just a boomer on steroids. So I'm going to wrap it up here because I know we all got to get to the break pretty quick. So where does the untapped potential and possibility of the millennial? Where might it lie? Well, I think first and foremost that one of the areas is between what I call an effective and useful and meaningful boomer-millennial bridge. I think there's enough distance between those generations that there can be a really good exchange. And I'm not just talking, well, you give me information technology exchange, and I'll give you my life story. Boomers love their stories. But I'm talking about a more meaningful one that speaks to the creativity and to the idealism. Because I think in every boomer, we left that era going, unfinished business. There's something that's missing. That passion piece when I was 18, 19, railing against the system to make change. And somehow, complacency set in. I think there's an opportunity for passion to be restored. That's the other part of the bridge. I think on the other exchange, we can give information, not just information. The boomers or the millennials full of information, but we can help them through experience and patience, turn that into both knowledge and wisdom and support that process. So I don't think that this fully wired in and wired up generation is as bad off as the doom and gloom rhetoric would tell us. I think, in fact, there's great possibility and potential. And allow me to just take you on a dream. So right here, I want to break into Elvis's If I Can Dream of Another Land, where all my brothers walk hand in hand. But here's the idea. Who here has heard of the idea of the earth as a whole brain? It's a kind of evocative concept. But let's say that every person on this planet currently represented 10 neurons. We would have roughly 7.4 billion people on the planet and 86 billion neurons. We are now Earth as a whole brain. But it's not finished there yet, because those neurons need social connectivity. They need to fire together and wire together, and they need to get strong. But if we were to just imagine, and of course we can just imagine, right? These little handheld devices, I got one in here, I don't know how to use properly. If we were to be able to connect with those, and you just envision a world where those neural pathways were lighting up in India, in Sri Lanka, in Australia, and Africa, as this millennial generation reaches at a new level. Sure, information stuff and new technology, at first we titillate ourselves with social media and other perverse stuff like maybe gambling. But if we hang in there long enough, the human brain is so creative and adaptable. Maybe this is how we take on the turbulence of tomorrow. Perhaps this is the untapped resilience of the millennial. Thank you.